Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being part of this project. I believe that this is a very important gathering of minds and exchange of views on a very important topic called Great Power Rivalry and Maritime Order in Southeast Asia. We have several experts ready to give you their inputs and opinions on the matters that they have spent many months discussing among themselves. But allow me to say something about the background. This seminar is a culmination of research work undertaken in the past 1.5 years. This is basically under what we call phase 1 of the Policy Research Network on Contemporary Southeast Asia. This network was initiated by GRIPS, our partner institute in Tokyo, Japan. GRIPS have co-organized it with RSIS, where I am now, and we have also another key partner in Indonesia, CSIS. Altogether, GRIPS, CSIS, and RSIS, we deploy our expertise, and these permanent researchers and staff in our respective institutions have worked together on a number of interesting areas and topics of concern to all of our institutes as well as our audience out there. The 4 broad areas, or what we call cluster, covered in these activities of research are: number 1, Great Power Rivalry and Maritime Order in Southeast Asia, which is the focus of today's webinar. Number 2, Sustainable Economic Development. Number 3, State Responses to Extremism. And number 4, Development Cooperation. In the coming weeks, the other experts and research team on each of these other 3 clusters will make their presentation, or if they are not ready to finish a presentation, they will update us on what has transpired so far. I'd like to thank my good friend, Ambassador Yutaka Imura, for being the primary mover, or what I call the guy that keeps pushing us to work on these clusters of research and to keep us on a relatively tight schedule. Hopefully, all of you who are participating today will find the presentation useful to what you are doing, and it will be good for us if we can also hear your feedback. Yeah, there are many things that are still uncertain, especially with regard to today's topic on Great Power Rivalry and Maritime Order. From RSIS, our team is led by Dr. Bobinda Singh and Jane Chan. Yeah, and they work together with Dr. Yusuke Takagi from GRIPS and other colleagues elsewhere. Before I pass on my screen to others, I want to take this opportunity, if I may, Ambassador Yutaka Imura, to pay tribute to the late Professor Eileen Baviera. Eileen is a dear friend from the Philippines, and I would say that she had followed ASEAN-China relations and all these strategic developments from the Philippines, from her university, from her center for a long time, and everybody, yeah, really miss her. She passed away suddenly in March 2020. Given the state of strategic and security affairs in Southeast Asia, the issue covered by this cluster on great power rivalries great power rivalry, and maritime order are very timely and topical. For us in Southeast Asia, the impact on ASEAN, our regional organization for Southeast Asian nation, will be of particular concern. We are sure that the research undertaken as part of the Policy Research Network on Contemporary Southeast Asia will contribute towards the policy discourse in the region. I'm also sure it will help regional countries in ASEAN, in Japan, and elsewhere in the region to respond more effectively to the common challenges we face. I will now pass over the proceeding to the panel, and before I finish, I'd like to once again thank all of you for being such a great contributor to this whole research endeavor. Thank you very much. Over to you, Imura-san.
Hi there, everyone. This is Pinder Singh here, and I'm from RSIS. I think we are facing some difficulty with I think Ambassador Imura. So we will get him back as soon as possible. So our team is actually working on this right now. I would just like to actually add that I'd like to thank in fact both ambassadors for in fact being here today, and then we truly in fact appreciate them in making time to join us here. In fact, they have both been extremely important architects of this entire project. And they have also been both, in fact, very important inspiration for this entire collaboration. So I think we still don't have Ambassador Imura on yet. So if I could just maybe take this opportunity to maybe introduce the two panelists. I think they have been, in fact, introduced, but let me just say. So we have two speakers today. We've got Suke, who is an associate professor from CRIPS, and we also have Jane Chan, who is a senior fellow, and she's also the coordinator of the Maritime Security Program at RSIS. Both have provided exceptional leadership in this cluster, and we are extremely thankful to them for steering us up to this point. And I've got a piece of good news, and I think Ambassador Imura is back. Ambassador Imura, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm back now. Sorry, because of the technical difficulties, my face has suddenly disappeared from the screen. Now I'm back. I just continue. I was just thanking to everybody for being with us, attending a series of webinars concluding the joint research conducted within the framework of PRNC, which is abbreviation of Policy Research Network on the Contemporary Southeast Asia. Taking this opportunity, I think I may be repeating what Ambassador On has been saying, but nevertheless, I wish to explain briefly our PRNC project. This network was established in 2019 jointly by ASEAN's major research institutions, to name a few: RSIS Singapore, CSIS Indonesia, ISIS also. ISIS is recently back, Malaysia, and Japan's GRIPS, to study the problems and challenges we are facing in the region. The project is composed of three components, namely annual conference, joint studies, and now with COVID-19 limiting cross-border human exchanges, monthly or bi-monthly webinars, which with variety of topics related to our region. Regarding joint studies, we have selected 5 topics. I think the Ambassador On has mentioned already 4 out of 5, but another one is on the environment, and which will be led by ISIS. And as I said, ISIS is back. I think they are now catching up, and within several months, we'll be also hearing the webinar or presentation on the environment. Now, we established research clusters for those topics with researchers coming from different institutions so that we could examine the problems from different angles and perspectives to enrich the researches. They have been working already more than a year and now ready to conduct a series of online presentations, most of which will be organized during the course of March this year, and we will keep you informed as soon as the other 4 clusters are ready to do presentation. After each online presentation, they will come up with written papers or publications being enriched by discussions we will have following the presentations. Toward the end of the year, namely 2021, or early next year, we will have next annual conference in Jakarta. Hopefully, with COVID-19 disappeared, face-to-face sessions can be arranged. This conference will kick off the second phase of PRNC project. During this phase, we will focus on Indo-Pacific cooperation centered on AOIP, or ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. We hope we can invite to this conference our colleagues not only from ASEAN and Japan, but also from major research institutes of East Asia Summit members countries. Now, all over the world, the attention is very much focused on Indo-Pacific region. And I think this is going to be the main topic to be discussed during the course of second phase. Concretely, particularly AOIP, ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. Well, thank you very much, and I think I will pass the floor to Jen and Takagi-san. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I will pass
Okay, thank you so much, Ambassador. If I could, before I pass on the floor to the 2 speakers, I would just like to share some of the housekeeping rules that we have. You can ask your question on the Q&A icon that is in fact available right at the bottom of the screen, right? And so we will try to get through as many questions as we can, and then the 2 functions, raise hand and the chat functions have been disabled, so please don't please don't use them, right? So each of the speaker will have 15 minutes each, and so now please let me invite Hosuke. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Bubuhinda, and thank you very much, both ambassador, to stay with us and then give us a great opportunity to present a kind of progress report of our research project. And the title of this cluster is actually the tentative title of the book project. And then the title of the book is, sorry, let's make it bigger. Yeah, so the title of the book is Great Power Rivalry and Maritime Order in Southeast Asia. And so this is the title. And before starting, actually, let me add one more thing. I mean, let me acknowledge actually two things. First of all, actually, we really appreciate, but I hugely miss Professor Eileen Barbiela from the Philippines. Actually, at the beginning of this project, Professor Barbiela is a part of our research team, but unfortunately, we lost her, but we will follow her scholarship by working hard on this topic. And secondly, it's just a personal thing, but I'm trained as a Philippine specialist and Southeast Asian specialist. But maritime order is not so close to my expertise until I became a faculty member of the Maritime Safety Security Program of GRIPS. In this program is a one-year master program we started. And then in the program, we have incumbent officers from Coast Guard organization in the region, both Southeast Asia, Japan, and recently South Asia. And this program actually enriched me the knowledge on the maritime order, and I'm so happy to work on this topic, especially with my co-editor, Ms. Jen Cham, to produce this book. So now let me start the contents. Background of our research. Yeah, we have observed growing interest in the region in the context of Great Power Rivalry, but we can still find a gap. The gap is Great Power bias. For instance, last year, or actually this year, Professor David Shambo, he's one of the leading scholar on China in the United States. And David Shambo published a very interesting, always informative, insightful book, Where Great Power Meets, America and China in Southeast Asia. So this is the title of the book. And then this book is very insightful and informative, and I encourage everybody to read it to get very important expertise from him. But still, we can find so-called kind of great power bias to see this region. This region, I mean Southeast Asia. Because for instance, people often say like, oh, this country is pro-China or this country is pro-US. The distance between a particular country with US or China, of course, physical or mental distance, became an agenda. And we call this like a great power bias. And we want to know the voice from Southeast Asia, from the Southeast Asian countries' perspective. So we try to go beyond great power bias in the book. And what's the problem of great power bias? There are two specific problems I want to specify. One, the transformation of Southeast Asian countries themselves. These countries become emerging states. Unlike the period of great power rivalry in 20th century, I mean the period of Cold War. In the period of Cold War, most of Southeast Asian countries were so-called developing countries, which depends on ODAs or technical aid. But in the 21st century, most of Southeast Asian countries became like emerging states with very competitive market and FDI and trade. And some countries like the Philippines, remittances are very important rather than ODA. Of course, ODA plays a role, but when you compare sheer size of ODA with FDI, trade, and remittances, ODA is only one part of a policy tool that we have to think about. and rather we should listen to the voice of each government in the region. And second, because they become developed, actually they spend more in defense budget. So we should appreciate this kind of growing capacities of Asian countries. When you compare this defense budget of each country with, say, defense budget of China or defense budget of the United States, maybe it's not so fruitful. But when you compare defense budget of this year and defense budget from 10 years ago or 20 years ago, we can see big changes. So we want to appreciate these kind of changes in our project. And more specifically, there are 3 points that I want to highlight as characteristics of this volume. First of all, this is a contribution from the think tanks in the region. And as both ambassadors highlight, this is a product by the Policy Research Network. So by definition, we are interested in policy making. And second point is the role of external middle powers. And we try to understand external middle powers' role in the region. So again, we are interested in international cooperation. And the third point is maybe academic contribution of this volume. By looking at policy making, we try to capture 3 changes. And I call this policy making driven approach. And against problem driven approach. By problem driven approach, we are thinking about research focusing on the problem and studying the background of the problem and probably try to figure out the reasons of the problem. And in conclusion, in this type of research, they focus on, explain a bit about policy implication of the research. And in our study, we would like to reverse this research strategy. We focus on policy making first. And by studying policy making at the beginning of our study, we try to get more concrete, even though it might be small, but a very concrete implication we try to get. Because we are very much interested in 3 types of changes. 1, institution evolution. Number 2, capacity building. And 3rd, rulemaking. What do we mean by these 3? First of all, institution evolution. By institution evolution, I mean development of ASEAN-led mechanism. ASEAN-led mechanism experienced the kind of evolutionary change ever since, say, making the ARF, or maybe we can go back to the period of APEC. We can appreciate the role of ASEAN as a center of this multilateral forum, APEC, ARF, and the East Asian Summit. And most recently, we have ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, ADMM, and ADMM Plus is an important example of institutional evolution. And second changes, the second change that we would like to study is the capacity building of each country. Each country develop their own capacity in security and safety field. And this is efforts by individual member states of ASEAN. So we would like to appreciate these capacity building efforts of each member state. And the third, we would like to study the efforts of rulemaking by ASEAN member states or maybe stakeholders too. By rulemaking, I mean that by rulemaking, some may think about the efforts to make code of conduct in South China Sea, which is of course important effort by ASEAN member states. But aside from code of conduct, we can think about the role of international law in the region in a broader context, mainly thanks to the Philippine efforts to bring the case to the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And this arbitration award became like a public, arguably it became like a public goods with which they can use when they legitimize their action in the region. Like Malaysia used it, and Indonesia mentioned it, of course, Philippines mentioned it when they explained their position towards South China Sea. And of course, no other than President Duterte, whose behavior is often characterized like pro-China, but even President Duterte clearly states that the arbitration award is a part of international law, and the Philippine government supports arbitration award as a part of international law. So in a sense, we can think about rulemaking as one of the changes that the region is observing. And to appreciate these changes, we set up the research team, and this is a tentative structure. And then the book is composed of 8 chapters, and this is the first part of the chapter. First part of the book. First of all, overview. It will be provided today's moderator, Professor Sin, and he provides us about Southeast Asian response to the US-China strategic competition. And in this overview, he provides historical background, and he argued that strategic competition of major powers is not new in the region. And we can get some lesson from Southeast Asian response to from the previous competition, and we can compare, we can get some new, of course, insight by looking at some lesson that we learned from previous competitions. And chapter 2 is on the rule-based order in maritime Southeast Asia. Here, my partner of this book making, co-editor, Ms. Jane Chan, discusses a very interesting evolution of arbitration award, or the politics after arbitration award in Southeast Asia. And the third chapter is US Alliance Network and Regional Maritime Order. And in this chapter, Professor Tokuchi of GRIPS highlights the transformation or evolution of institution in the region in terms of security sector. Because in the Cold War period, we tend to discuss hub and spoke system, but in recent years, we are now talking about alliance network, and we can think about Japan-Philippine relations, or maybe Philippine-Australia relations, or maybe Singapore-Philippine relations. So this is an example of alliance network. And this is a new dimension of regional order. And fourth chapter goes to the evolution of ASEAN-led mechanism. Especially Dr. Mohibat from CSIS Indonesia talks about ADMM and ADMM Plus as a case to understand institutional evolution in ASEAN. And this is the latter part of the structure. And chapter 5 is about ASEAN Centrality. And some may argue ASEAN Centrality is at the crossroad, but we don't know which way ASEAN will go. So in this chapter, we suppose that Mr. Sharman Rockman from ISIS Malaysia discuss or revisit the idea of ASEAN centrality in the context of great power rivalry. And chapter 6 and 7 is a kind of complementary chapters, because in this chapter, chapter 6, Dr. Bing from BASS from Vietnam, he talks about maritime security challenges. And specifically, he focused on 2 challenges. One is illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, or IUU fishing. And another one is maritime robbery in Southeast Asia. And he focuses on the policy response to these challenges by looking at the role of SIFTEC from Bangkok. And also, he talks about Malacca Strait Patrol of 3 countries. And in my chapter, Evolving Cooperation Schemes in ASEAN Sub-Region, I focus on Sulu-Sulawesi Seas. And in next slides, I will explain a bit about the provisionary finding of this chapter. And after that, we conclude our discussion and try to get very concrete recommendations. Probably our policy recommendation might be not it's not so big picture, but based on the concrete example of policy responses by ASEAN countries, and try to make a very concrete policy recommendation in this book project. So the last part of my presentation today is the provisionary findings of my chapter, and I focus on Sulu-Sulawesi or Celebes Sea. And this is the map of East Asia. And South China Sea is here. And just next to South China Sea, we have Sulu Sea and Celebes Sea. And by looking at these two seas, we can observe a kind of evolution of independent institutions of littoral states, like the Philippines. Okay, let me go one by one. So in Indonesia, they established Satgas 115, a special task force to counter IUU fishing. In Malaysia, in Sabah, they established East Sabah Special Commando to address the possible incursion from the Sulu Archipelago. And the Philippines established Coast Watch South, which now transformed into National Coast Watch Center to address terrorist network. So we can see the establishment of new institutions by littoral states to address various maritime non-traditional threats. By looking at these developments, we can conclude that they have enhanced state capacity in the field of maritime domain awareness, or MDA. So this is one conclusion. But after that, we can identify the challenges ahead. So while MDA capacity is enhanced, the coordination mechanism is still underutilized, partly because different policy goals of each littoral state. As I said, for instance, Indonesia made Satgas 115 to address IUU fishing, and the Philippines made Coast Watch South to address terrorism network. So how to coordinate the effort of these new institutions is a challenge ahead. So there are several attempts to enhance the coordination of these institutions, and this is one challenge that we can study further in the future as a future agenda. So the provisional findings of this research is that we should not underestimate the changes the member states experience. But at the same time, we should appreciate difference in policy goals of each state in the region. And the next conclusion or implication is that we should distinguish the policy area where we need more equipment from the policy area where we need more cooperation. Like in the case of Sulu Celebes Sea, yeah, maybe we need more equipment, but at the same time, littoral states already established institutions. So probably we can enhance or encourage littoral states to strengthen the coordination rather than building up new equipment. That might be one implication of at least my chapter 7. So thank you very much. And this is still an ongoing project, so your questions and comments are most welcome. And let me finish sharing the slide and pass the screen to Ms. Chan. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Suke. And now I would like to invite Jane Chan to please take over. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bhupinder. A very good afternoon, one and all. A quick word of thanks to Takagi-sensei and all the contributors for their continued hard work in the project. Indeed, as Takagi-sensei mentioned, it is an ongoing project. So it's a real privilege for me to be part of this group of experts putting our minds together on a timely topic. And since Takagi-sensei already carried the load of the briefing today, I'll keep my remarks short to allow for more time for discussion later. So onto the task at hand. We all know that regional maritime environment depends partly on global developments and partly on local ones specific to Southeast Asia. The safety and security of regional waters is also important for the interests of countries far beyond this region, as it is for our immediate neighbors. So given the limited time that we have, I will simply raise 3 broad issues explored in the various chapters of this project. First, on assessing order and a common maritime vision in Southeast Asia. Second, on regional institutions and the management of great power relations. And third, to touch on Asean Centrality as it is a common theme raised by the various contributors in the project. So first, on order and a common vision. In my view, it is rather clear that through the chapters, there's no common outlook on what the Southeast Asian maritime future would look like. Those whose vision is a competitive one has insisted that the strategic environment is a zero-sum game and that it is currently dominated by great power competition and rivalry. Even as extra-regional powers extend their interest to cooperate with Southeast Asia, many are concerned that these could add complexity to ongoing Sino-US rivalry. One of the chapters look at challenges to the traditional freedoms of the sea arising from jurisdictional disputes about who owns what, about the jurisdiction and obligation of coastal states versus the rights and duties of the user states, about lax observations of agreed principles of law, rules, and regulations. We see nation states forgetting that UNCLOS was a product of a grand bargain, one that was forged through difficult compromises which we may not achieve again. In this vision of the world, we can expect very little cooperation and a rather high risk of fractured regional institutions and that of conflict. Conversely, there's also a vision of a cooperative nature, reminding us that the success of our nations depends on seaborne trade and the globalized system that it leads to. Of course, still acknowledging that this system is under threat, and it is not just because of great power competition. Examples include the damaging effects of the various maritime security threats, such as piracy and armed robbery, IUU fishing, trafficking, smuggling, and so forth. One of the chapters examined the efforts made in tackling piracy, sea robbery, and IUU fishing in regional waters. These threats to maritime security are well known and frequently raise questions and recommendations on what we need to do. I'm sure you know by heart. Measures to deal with these threats offer a good vehicle for engaging regional partners so that not only will such cooperation and collaboration help mitigate the impact of the threat, there is a hope that it will engender trust and confidence. That being said, apart from the recognition of just how important maritime security is, in nearly all countries, balancing commitments and resources is getting more and more difficult, not least in a time of global pandemic, so priorities matters. On top of that, the question remains whether cooperation on these maritime security issues of common interest will lead to a spillover effect to help alleviate the trust deficit in the region that is much talked about, and arguably one of the leading cause for increased risk of conflict. Some will argue that the current trend in the ASEAN-China relations, for example, suggests that cooperation at the practical level has very little impact on trust at the strategic level. So back to the point on whether we in the region can realistically have a common vision that we are committed to. One thing we learned from COVID-19 thus far is that multilateral cooperation is essential. As major global trends continue to reshape the strategic outlook in the Indo-Pacific region, this geopolitical uncertainty gives new impetus to ASEAN to cooperate with our partners and friends. And this brings me to my second point about regional institutions and great powers. Maritime-related issues and concerns have a major influence in interstate dynamic between Southeast Asian countries and in relations between these countries and the rest of the world. And these relations will always contain elements of cooperation and competition. The question is how regional countries in turn manage the expectations of these external interests. So a key feature built into the ASEAN-led regional architecture is that it is open and inclusive. So no single state's influence is exclusive, so to speak, not China, not the US. And the various regional groupings provide inclusive platforms for ASEAN to engage its partners and extra-regional powers. And one of the chapters explored this point more extensively with complementing case studies on the ADMM and ADMM Plus mechanisms. While many in Southeast Asia share anxieties about China and see the US as the resident power in the region, ASEAN states still need to be mindful of the robust and pragmatic relations with China that each has painstakingly nurtured. Southeast Asian observers amongst us will know how challenging that can be from time to time. And this is clearly iterated by Singapore's Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, that Singapore, like the rest of Southeast Asia, I quote, live at the intersection of the interests of the various major powers and must avoid being caught in the middle or forced into invidious choices, end quote. And since the region cannot exclude any of this power, the best strategy has been to engage them all. And this brings me to my third and final point on ASEAN centrality. We have one chapter specifically on ASEAN Centrality, and this issue is raised across a few other chapters as well. So I'll leave you to read the expert's opinion on this issue later. In my view, to illustrate this point about ASEAN centrality, it may be useful to consider how ASEAN has responded to the various Indo-Pacific strategies and concepts, and also the Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. Long story short, ASEAN eventually came up with the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, the AOIP, which reiterated its own community and connectivity plans for an open, inclusive, prosperous Southeast Asia. It is not ideological and consists no value proposition on existing rivalry or confrontation. And one of the reasons behind ASEAN reservations is keenly tied to ASEAN centrality, and if it could be negatively affected. I think the concern here is a straightforward one. Will having another regional grouping that is not ASEAN-led threaten the already fragile ASEAN centrality? Given ASEAN's performances in recent years, it is only natural, in my view, for any stakeholders, including Southeast Asia's closest partner, to question ASEAN's convening power. And it is incumbent on ASEAN to prove its worth, if it is to remain central. Of course, one could argue that the ambiguity of ASEAN centrality and the deliberate vagueness help create strategic space for a grouping which includes some small and some weak states to enjoy a measure of latitude they would otherwise not have on their own. Certainly not in a regional environment where great powers dynamic presumably threatens rather than assure ASEAN of its place. And if we can agree that ASEAN's centrality relies on the goodwill and support of major powers to thrive, as much as ASEAN member states' own commitment to institutional cohesion, then the last few years taught ASEAN a key lesson that whatever goodwill and support ASEAN enjoyed or still enjoying should not be taken for granted. I shall end my remark there, and I look forward to discussing more about our project with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Jane, and to both of you for giving us a very nice overview of this entire project in terms of all the core issue areas that we are going to be covering, as well as the entire framework that this book is going to be, in fact, going to be applying. So now we move into the Q&A section or session, and I would encourage everyone to leave their questions in the Q&A tab. So while we wait for that, I think if I could just maybe start the discussion by posing, I think, some questions about how you guys came about to in fact decide on the core issue areas that are going to go into the book, right? So I've got actually 3 questions here that maybe we can use to maybe start our discussion. One is, if you guys can maybe help us understand, how did you guys decide on the themes that were included in the book that I think were very, very clearly introduced in your presentation? If you could just maybe give us a nice overview of how you guys came up with those selection. And then number 2 is that, are there any general themes or in fact lessons or patterns that you both have noticed as a result of reading all the chapters that we could all take back today, and we could in fact look for those in fact when the book is published. And then my final question is actually, I recall when we first started this project, in fact it was before COVID-19. So how has this pandemic affected the contents of the book and also this entire research that we are doing? Has there been like a major impact or a change in the way that you both have approached the topics in the book, or not, right? So maybe I'll stop there, and then I'll let you both maybe answer the questions that you want to answer, and then so if you could start maybe with like Yusuke, if you can start first, and then I will invite Jane after that.
Okay, thank you very much for bringing that. Yeah, actually, I think I addressed 2 points in my presentation: how to come up with topics or the themes of this book in my presentation. But maybe we can go back to our first discussion with you and other contributors in Singapore, where we talk about great power rivalry and maritime order. And at first, we talk about a very common, the topics that people are talking about when it comes to the maritime order or great power rivalry. By that, we mean like an Indo-Pacific strategy, or Japan free and open Indo-Pacific vision, or maybe, of course, China's BRI. These are the major things that we have in our mind. Of course, AOIP was there. But yeah, of course, we study these, but at the same time, we try to capture the changes on the ground in ASEAN, each ASEAN countries, or maybe ASEAN itself. So after that, I mean, as a writer of overview, I think you will cover this big topic, Bhupinder. And the chapter writers would like to discuss more about the ongoing changes of each country's ASEAN experiencing, instead of talking about a big, big vision of great powers. That's first one. And second, a general theme, as I said, I mean, I call this like a policy-making driven approach against problem-driven approach. And this is, again, the approach we try to appreciate the changes that each member state are carrying out. And the third point, COVID. Yeah, actually, I also think about the impact of COVID. But surprisingly, the behavior of major superpowers didn't change a lot. I mean, for instance, pointing out China still maintained a very assertive action in South China Sea, even during the COVID crisis. And actually, the Trump administration was also very aggressive to counter Chinese action. So despite COVID challenge, at least maritime order, I don't think we have to change the topic. Rather, maybe we have to enhance the description, or maybe add some new information, but it doesn't change the structure of the concept of the book itself. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Jane, if you would like to chime in, yeah.
Yes, indeed, as Yosuke mentioned, the theme of the chapters, right, were in fact, discussed and by consensus, right, around the table of the contributors on, as issue that we ought to focus on. And you see, and this is related to your third question as well, and you see that, the focus of the contributors were in fact on some of the evergreen issues in the region, right? Evergreen issues that, extra-regional countries are interested in as well. So, in answering your question about the impact of pandemic, for one, the pandemic is not over, right? So in a way, I think it's too soon for us to assess, if there are policy changes in that way. But already, as Yosuke has highlighted, we have seen impacts in terms of the evergreen issues that we are looking at, for example, the South China Sea issue, and how, precisely because of the COVID, how the South China Sea consultative process has been stalled, right? And, this is being considered by the chapter on institutions, and how, we continue the dialogue, with our partners and friends, despite, these challenges. And if we look at, the evergreen issues, I think, and we peel it back, you see that there's a lot of ASEAN-dominated concerns, right? And this is timely in a way that, we look at the impact of great power rivalry and, how internally within ASEAN, there is still no a coherent outlook in terms of, how to manage this, both as an institution and also, to consider the impact of great power competition. I think the third evergreen issue is, of course, competition aside, is are we seeing, extra regional powers, looking for alternatives beyond ASEAN? And that, again, is another concern that is addressed, across a few chapters. So in a way, to pull this and tie this back into the focus and the direction of the chapters is because, a theme like that, a topic like that, there are a lot of book projects and a lot of papers out there addressing it. So what we are trying to feature, as Yosuke has highlighted, and I won't repeat, is to give a little bit more regional flavors in terms of, what the policy recommendations are, rather than, just a theoretical discourse. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. In fact, I have like a few other questions, but I think I will save mine, and then I'll go to the Q&A tab, because there are like a few questions there. There's a question from Fan Xuan Dung, who is a student here in RSIS. His question is, what role can external middle powers or the Quad play in helping Southeast Asian states tackling NTS maritime security threats? So how can middle powers or the Quad play in helping Southeast Asian states tackle non-traditional maritime security threats? Would you guys want to tackle that? Jane, I think.
Yes, I'll take that one.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, in a way, if we look at the maritime environment in Southeast Asia, and I've briefly mentioned this in terms of, the stakeholders involved, right? It's not just the Southeast Asian states who are stakeholders in, the safety and security of regional waters. So in that sense, it's thinking about, how do we collaborate with friends and partners, right? You asked about middle powers and Quad. I would rather think that, if we think about why Southeast Asia is still resistant to the Quad, for that matter, or the Indo-Pacific concept and strategy. Ironically, if you look into the key principles behind what is being put forth, right, with the Indo-Pacific concepts, with their interest in safety and security, freedom of navigation, etc. These are all principles that, bodes very well with ASEAN. Unfortunately, how it's being presented to Southeast Asia, and what the Quad represents right now. I think, the China factor weighs in very strongly in terms of, the Quad. The question has always been, or more like the prevailing perception, is that supporting the Quad is synonymous to taking sides against, taking sides in the great power rivalry, right? So, we want to be able to distinct between, these great powers' interests that is at the strategic level, and, there are very practical concerns about maritime security threats and challenges, right? At the threats and, at the practical front, there has been, multiple and different types of, initiative and mechanisms where ASEAN member states, or specifically individual Southeast Asian countries who are dealing with, a specific maritime security threats, have been working well with external powers and external partners, right? So at the end of the day, it's thinking about, whether a specific threat is one that is common within ASEAN, or is it one that's being faced by the littoral states themselves? Because those that are being faced by the littorals, we have seen very good initiatives that is not under the ASEAN umbrella. So you don't need the institution as a whole to tackle it as a whole, right? We have, a ASEAN Minus X approach or minilateral approach where, the littoral states tackle it on their own with help, again, sometimes with partners and friends outside of the region. So it boils down to, having a mechanism or a structure or a framework, for that matter, that is supposed to be inclusive and flexible, that, can help the littoral state address the maritime security threats and challenges that we are talking about.
Right, in fact, at this point, right, I mean, I was just wondering whether if this is the point maybe to raise. I mean, there is in fact a lot of talk that ASEAN wants to stay in the center. It wants to stay in a position where it is that it is not it's not forced to choose sides, right, in between the US and China, right, and then the entire multilateral structure is in fact structured based on that, right? So it is to actually invite all countries to actually engage strongly, and so that the ASEAN doesn't have to choose, but if ASEAN plays an important convening role for all the major powers to actually engage strongly here, right? So if I were to push you guys a little bit further, is that how long can that last? What are the conditions that we have to all look out for to actually then in fact realize that, oh no, in fact it is time that this is not at all feasible anymore, right? If ASEAN is not able to stay in the middle and not choose. Do you guys have any thoughts on that? On what are some of the conditions that we have to look out for, or we should be, I think, mindful of, it's okay. You want?
All right. I try to take my responsibility, but it's a very tough question, and I think you can answer this question in an overview written by you. And actually, I'm now referring to your draft. You are mentioning multifaceted approach by Southeast Asian countries, and I think this is a key because the great power rivalry in the 20th century is very simple, like Eastern Bloc and Western Bloc, and there's no multi-facet. But in this great power rivalry in the 21st century, we have to look at each policy areas, like even the technology. We should distinguish very high-tech area and a very low-tech area, and then in which policy area we should be very vocal and clear about the position, and in some area maybe we can maintain the vague, position. And as long as we have these multiple policy areas, maybe ASEAN can stay in the position of convener. If ASEAN provides only one policy arena where stakeholders can discuss only one issue, then it will be the end of the convening power of ASEAN. That's my take.
Yeah, sure. Jane, would you like to chime in here? Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of a few questions on the ASEAN centrality issue, right? Whether, what behavior would China need to do or the US need to do. And again, I want to draw this to the Quad and the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy and looking at how ASEAN responded, right? It took a while before, all four of the Quad countries with their respective, Indo-Pacific concepts and strategy to then, highlight that, ASEAN centrality is front and center, right? So the critics amongst us will say that, oh, it is an afterthought, right? It is an afterthought, and that by now, even though in every reference, ASEAN centrality is being referenced, the importance of ASEAN mechanism is being referenced, even at the highest level, right, by the head of states, it still didn't sound convincing to Southeast Asia. I mean, for various reasons, of course. But one of the point that, you know, I want to tease out, and this is related to, you know, what behavior or not, is, I suppose, you know, linked to how ASEAN simply, in my view, simply do not have the confidence that, you know, China will be understanding. Right, we'll be understanding in the way that if ASEAN is seen to be promoting ties with the Quad countries, ASEAN is not working against China. You know, I'm not sure if I can reverse the argument here for the US. You know, I'll leave it to the experts within amongst us to tackle this as well, right? So in a way, you know, is it about ASEAN centrality? You know, is it about, you know, ASEAN Southeast Asian countries, you know, to continue to be relevant, right? We have, of course, heard all sorts of narrative that, you know, the importance of ASEAN is not just about dealing with great power rivalry right now, right? Right, it is very important to Southeast Asian countries, but let's not forget that, you know, was it, in fact, you know, being established to deal with extra-regional powers? It is, right? So, you know, in that sense, Bhupinder, to answer your questions in terms of, you know, will ASEAN continue to be relevant in that sense, or, you know, are there signs that, you know, we are worried about? I would say that right now, within Southeast Asia, there's already a lot of concern, right? Right now, you know, there is already a lot of thinking. And one thing is for sure is that we do see, you know, some momentum among Southeast Asian countries wanting to do something about it. I think that's a good sign. I'm not sure, you know, if it's too late, and I'm not sure if we are moving fast enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So now let me again go back to the Q&A, because we've got a lot of questions coming in. And okay, there's a question from Stephen Smith who asks a question about you know, the ASEAN centrality. What Chinese behaviors do regional states view as helpful to our regional security, and also what Chinese behaviors do regional states view as unhelpful to regional security? Would you guys like to take this on?
Well,
what kind of role does China play positively and negatively, I guess, right? So that's the question. Yeah.
Yeah. Bhupinder, in my previous intervention, I was attempting to answer that question. Okay. Obviously not very well, so you didn't get that in the sense. But I suppose, you know, if we take the South China Sea as an example, right? We take the South China Sea as an example, you know, and we see in my view, a cyclical behavior, right? At some point, you know, where they were very enthused about the negotiation of the code of conduct, right? And that seems to be, you know, helpful. But then again, this is after, you know, in my view, how China would have squandered a lot of goodwill, precisely because of, you know, since 2009, you know, the whole South China Sea debacle happened, right? So in that sense, you know, if we draw ourselves a bit further, because the question has always been, oh, you know, should Southeast Asian countries draw in more extra-regional powers, you know, or extra-regional navies to swarm, to crowd the South China Sea? Will that help, right? My comment has always been this, is, look, you know, in my view, whatever Southeast Asia do or extra-regional powers do, China will not be able to roll back their claims in the South China Sea, not in the short and medium term, at least, for domestic reasons, in that matter. But in a way, you know, China is also not able to stop the US and its partners and friends from operating in the South China Sea, right? Not without starting a war, of course, which experts amongst us will say that they are unlikely to win, but, you know, that's a totally different discussion. So in that sense, you know, whilst, you know, we can talk about how we assess Chinese behavior, I think we are also trying to show them, you know, how, you know, Southeast Asia is behaving. We also want to recommend that, extra-regional powers to behave in a way that we want China to behave in regional waters, right? Again, a slightly challenging balance there, because, looking at, how great power engagements is moving towards, I think, Southeast Asian countries are concerned that, it is getting out of hand, right? That being said, if we draw it away from the South China Sea spotlight, right? To me, to look at, the regional dynamics is always too myopic to only focus on the South China Sea, because there are so many other, issues that, has a bearing in terms of, how extra-regional powers is engaging Southeast Asia. And from that angle, then, there are, areas and avenues where ASEAN-China relations can grow for the positive, right? This year, we are celebrating 30th anniversary of the ASEAN-China dialogue relationship, right? There is some optimism still, South China Sea apart, in terms of, what ASEAN and China can achieve. But having said that, I must share my reservations in terms of, whether or not, there is a meeting of minds, right? In a way, you hear ASEAN and China using a lot of similar words and terminology, right? There needs to be trust, there needs to be confidence, there needs to be cooperation, collaboration. But whether or not there's actually a meeting of minds, whether or not they share a common vision, I think that remains to be seen. I'm not convinced myself, but the same argument can be laid on, ASEAN-US relations and ASEAN relations with the rest of the great powers who has an interest in Southeast Asia. Do we actually have a same vision? Is there a meeting of minds despite the rhetorics, right? The rhetorics may sound the same. So these, I think, would require, more exploration and more, dialogues for us to better understand each other.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Suki, would you like to jump in here, or would you rather that I go on to the next question?
Okay, just one quick point.
Yes, please.
Yeah, all external powers should appreciate practical problem of ASEAN member countries. That's my response. Because strategic agenda, I mean, all countries have strategic agenda. Like China has it, US has it, and then of course Singapore has it, Philippines has it. Any country has strategic agenda. And we should understand, we should analyze this, but at the same time, we should appreciate the practical problems of each member state. And on this point, I would like to highlight more the difference between ASEAN's interest and ASEAN member countries' interest. There are some overlapping, but there are differences between ASEAN's interest as an institution and ASEAN member countries' interest. They are different. And in our project, we try to appreciate and then clarify the practical agenda that each member state, aside from ASEAN, are facing and addressing.
Okay, great. So if we could actually shift our focus to the US now. I think we have, spoken a lot about China. There's a question by Charlie Brown, who actually who was asking what kind of agenda would actually benefit like ASEAN members when they meet, and so when they meet the new US administration officials, right? And so what he's asking is that what kind of like issues or what kind of like agenda should if ASEAN countries actually propose when they meet and so when they meet the new US administration to make sure that the US, I guess, in fact, remains like strongly engaged, right? So I think that's the goal, right? So what kind of agenda would you guys propose if you guys were advising ASEAN and your own leaders, right? And in terms, so what kind of issues would you add into the agenda of the ASEAN-US summit? Yeah. Yes, please.
So let me get on this question. Actually, this is a continuation of my response to the previous questions. And I highlight capacity building in my presentation. And capacity building is a kind of buzzword among the US policymakers ever since, in my understanding, the 9/11. In the context of global war on terror, US provided many aid to enhance the capacity of Southeast Asian countries as a second front line of the global war on terror. So capacity building efforts should be found on first of all by the ASEAN member state by itself, but actually capacity building is happening in cooperation with external powers like the United States, or not only the US, but Japan is also providing some aid to enhance capacity. So again, going back to the practical, US or other external powers should appreciate practical problems they are facing. And one agenda is maybe maritime domain awareness, as I said. And then they appreciate the support for maritime domain awareness in the field. But the question is, like, what is the policy goal of enhancement of maritime domain awareness? Because each nation state has different policy goal, even though they share the term like maritime domain awareness capacity building. Thanks.
Thank you. Jane, would you like to share?
Yes, Charlie will know my answer on this, right? To me, my baseline is very simple. Make it happen first, right? Make sure it happens on both ends, right? On the US side to show, a real investment in time and effort to make it happen. And of course, the ASEAN side to correspond as well, right? To be welcoming and to put, useful agenda. I don't have anything beyond, what Yosuke has mentioned, but one thing is important is to distinguish, the objective of each of the institution and to make sure that, we do not put agenda that don't fit the purpose, right? So coming back to this specific question on, what should we put on the ADMM Plus and the summit? Two very distinct platforms with two very different purpose. And we want to be quite clear that, if we are thinking about, ASEAN role in managing great power relations, I don't think it should be on any of these platforms. The two that was given as an example, either on ADMM Plus or the ASEAN US Summit. To me, in my mind, the ASEAN US Summit should really focus on, bringing ASEAN and US back together again, right? To once again, try to be at the table to realign priorities, right? Rather than trying to put, on each side, what your priorities are, is to realign the priorities first and foremost before deciding, what should be the next agenda. Similarly, on the ADMM Plus, I think ADMM Plus, there have been, a good momentum there already, especially, with the ADMM +1 informal dialogues as well, and those are making good headways. But, of course, the ADMM +1, the informal dialogue with the US is lacking behind the ADMM plus China and ADMS plus Japan, right? So, again, this is something for our American friends to think about how to play the catch-up game on that sense.
Great. If I could also add to your answers here. I've got actually 4 points maybe to add to this, I think, agenda. I think one is to actually ensure that in fact, the US remains strongly engaged in the region through actually both, like multilateral and bilateral terms, right? That's one. I think two, it is to I think restore dialogue with, I think, PRC, right? That I think would be, I think, important for us here. I think like in this, I think this part of the world. Then I think number three would be to increase infrastructure investment in the region. I think that would be, I think, immensely helpful and to counter, I think, the huge investment that I think PRC has already invested here, right? And four, I think it is to deploy ambassadors to all the countries here. I think that would be, I think, a huge, in fact, a huge improvement from the previous administration, actually, right? So I will stop there. Okay, so there's a question about your book chapters actually, which I thought was interesting. They say that among the chapters that you presented, the question is, don't you think that it is necessary to have a topic on region maritime security institutions? May it be the Navy or the Coast Guards, considering that these institutions play an essential role in engaging the great powers and even the external middle powers. So, how would you both? Okay, Jane, please.
A very good idea. To share with you a little bit of background, which we tried to address earlier on, there were 10 of us initially in the working group. Yusuke will remember this. There were at least 25 topics on the table. So every contributor had at least 2 or 3 topics in mind. So, you know, it is really an exercise of priority. Unfortunately, you know, some topics would have to go, and, you know, the topic that you suggested was in fact, you know, one that we thought about that was, you know, important, and whether, you know, it can come into a one of the chapter or a standalone chapter. But this is where, you know, I perhaps, you know, would suggest to Yosuke that looks like we have a volume 2 for our project.
Okay, Yusuke, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, it's a very good idea, and I hope that our great moderator will absorb this question to your chapter.
Okay, so then let me, I think, move on now to the next question. Okay, there is a question about China's PRC being a hegemonic actor here, and in fact, the question is the posture of the ASEAN members without claims to the South China Sea is demonstrating the hollowness of the centrality norm. Even though the PRC has signed the TAC, they are undermining it from within. Good question, I must say. Would you guys be able to respond to this? If China behaving in a way where it is actually, on the one hand, agreeing to all the ASEAN normative structure in a framework, but on the other hand, it is also undermining it, right? So how is ASEAN dealing with it?
Just a quick response. It's really too good question to answer in such a short time.
Yeah.
So maybe one thing is that we should appreciate chronological development of Chinese behavior. In my view, China changed a lot around in 2009 or 10. I mean, before China had more moderate position and accepting TAC and TSC and except South China Sea and except its behavior toward Vietnam and the Philippines. China was not that aggressive until 2009 or 10, but after that it changed, and we should appreciate the change. And maybe the way we address this question is to think about the changing response from ASEAN countries in our book. But this is a really good question. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Jane, would you like to tackle this as well? No, you are on mute, Jane. So
sorry. Yeah. So I agree with Yosuke's intervention on this, and I won't add to that. But perhaps draw this to another question regards to the South China Sea, right, where there is a very obvious example of the issue at hand, which ASEAN, in my mind, is not dealing well enough. But if we want to think about, and I want to draw this to what we expect in the South China Sea and the future in the South China Sea, it always come back to not just what China is doing in the South China Sea. I think we also want to think about what the ASEAN and Southeast Asian countries want to see in the South China Sea. To this point, I'm still not persuaded that, the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian member states and China are aligned in terms of, what the priorities are and how we can get there, despite being in the COC negotiation, consultative process, right? And if we judge it by the consultative process, it is no secret that all 10 ASEAN member states don't see eye to eye, right? China aside, within the ASEAN member states, we are not seeing it eye to eye. And it is very clear that, China has very different plans, right, from the Southeast Asian state. So in a way, if we are in agreement on that very basic premise that all parties have very different agenda, which again is not at all, surprising as Yusuke has mentioned, then, what are we looking to achieve with the COC? In my mind, at least, there is no illusion whatsoever, at least in Southeast Asia, that the COC can change behavior overnight. I believe that, it can still be it will still be useful as a basis of self-restraint, a big hope there. And I'm a researcher and academic, so I can afford to be a bit more optimistic, and unrealistic here. But it should also be a good guideline for cooperation and management of risk in regional waters.
Okay, so we've got, and so we're now on our final two questions. There is a question about ASEAN centrality that is being too focused on political security issues. So the question is, should ASEAN put more focus on the other focus? So what I think he actually means is the social, cultural, economic, right? Do you guys think that the entire notion of ASEAN centrality is too focused on the politics side and the security side, or do you think otherwise? Yes.
After reading this question, I feel like I get old because, traditionally ASEAN is not a forum for political security agenda, and member countries hate talking about this issue. If member countries are talking and focusing on this issue, it's a great progress of ASEAN as a regional institution. And so that's my first response. But a bit joke aside, ASEAN should talk more about economic issue, but also social dimension, because the gap in each member state is so huge, thanks to some extent, miraculous growth of many countries in the region. So the challenge is maybe social dimension, like, the pandemic is a good case to think about the future agenda for ASEAN collaboration. But I feel like this question reflects ASEAN development to me.
Okay. Interesting. Jane, would you like to chime
in? No, I'll just take this question and then place it on our contributor writing on the chapter on ASEAN centrality to see whether we can address it adequately.
Okay, great. Okay, there is the question about if this is the question I think that is meant to look into the future. It's by Koki Sato. So the question goes like this: from the viewpoint of maritime security or even regional stability, what would the ideal state of the South China Sea in the post-China dominated world? So here I'm assuming that we are already in a Chinese control region world. As a medium-term goal, such as a control of the islands and the areas of South China Sea by PKO and creating unarmed areas. So I didn't understand the last part, but I think the part about what would the ideal state of the South China Sea be in the post-China world? Do you guys get it? Would you guys be able to answer the question? So what would so I'm assuming here, right? So so what would be the state of the South China Sea be when China achieves dominance here?
Well, Bhupinder, in my mind, I think it's pointless to crystal ball gaze.
Yes.
To hypothesize about a post-China dominated world. But in this current day and age, right? Where in the current real world that we are facing right now, I think the ideal end state is an obvious one, right? We wish that, you know, the disputes, you know, both territorial and maritime can be resolved in accordance with international law without the use of force or threat of use of force, right? We wish that, you know, that the COC negotiation can be concluded swiftly, again, for the purposes that I mentioned earlier, you know, as a guide for cooperation and to manage, you know, future risks in that sense. So, you know, that would be the ideal end state today. Whether or not that should change, you know, post-China dominated world, I'll leave it to, you know, the professor amongst us to hypothesize.
Okay, Yusuke, do you want to say something here? Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, I have the same reservation with Jen about this post-China dominated world, but about ideal situation of South China Sea, I have two things to share. Of course, one is the vision can be found in the Japanese government policy one. It's a free and open, so that's one. But another thing is when I talk with, say, for instance, people from the Philippines working on the South China Sea issue, former Justice of Supreme Court of the Philippines, Antonio Carpio, said once that we should make you know, maritime protected area in South China Sea to make a natural park. And because fishing resources are quite important resources we have to be concerned about. And South China Sea is an incubator of many fishes, and we have to protect it. And we should not contend it the resources over with, you know, militarized islands. But instead of militarized island, we should protect resources there. That is one ideal vision we can promote maybe. Thank you.
Right. Okay. And so we have come to the end of our session. I would like to maybe turn back to the two speakers if they have any concluding remarks.
Maybe I should go first. In a way, you know, I would like to thank, you know, all the participants for their question, because this really allows us to think about, you know, think through some of our chapters, because some of our contributors are actually sitting in the audience as well. So your question, which, you know, very likely we didn't address properly because it's not our area of expertise, but, you know, they are listening in, we assure you. And, you know, we do hope that, you know, we can continue this particular conversation with you as well. Since you have our contact details, you know, please write into us as well with your specific question, especially those that, you know, we didn't address adequately, because I would like for us to share this with the contributors so that we can address them, you know, well in the chapters, to make sure that the volume that we put together in the end is of use.
Yes. So it's okay.
Yeah, actually, I have nothing to say except appreciation, and thank you very much for joining us. And this is still ongoing project, and as Jen said, that we do appreciate today's input from you. And I also appreciate your patience until the end of the webinar. I really appreciate your presence. Thank you very much.
Great news. Thank you both. I'm sure that, you know, you all agree that we've had in fact a good stimulating session. Thank you to the two ambassadors. Thank you to the two speakers, and also thank you to you all for being part of this session. So we all look forward to even more questions from you all. Please do feel free to send us all the questions that you actually have. Right. So for now, I'm going to actually end this session. Thank you very much, and we look forward to our next hosting you to our next event. Okay, bye, and see you all soon. Take care.